I was replacing a washer on the utility sink in the basement of the building when I first met him. That's the image I keep coming back to. My hands were wrapped around a pipe wrench, my knees were on a rubber mat, and I had a smear of grease across the back of my wrist. I was 62 years old, and I was doing what I had done every morning for the past 19 years, showing up early, working quietly, and making sure everything ran the way it was supposed to. I heard the elevator doors open behind me, and I heard my daughter's voice before I saw her face. "Dad, we're here," she said. I set down the wrench and stood up slowly. My knees don't cooperate the way they used to. I wiped my hands on a rag I keep in my back pocket, the way I always do, the way my own father taught me to do before I was old enough to understand what work actually meant. My daughter, Claire, was standing in the doorway with a man I had never met. He was tall, well-dressed, somewhere in his early 30s. Dark jacket, no tie, the kind of casual confidence that comes from a certain kind of upbringing. He looked around the basement the way people look at something they are trying to figure out how to politely ignore. "This is Garrett," Claire said. She was smiling, but there was something careful behind the smile. The way you smile when you are hoping two things will go together and you are not entirely sure they will. I walked toward them and extended my hand. "Gordon Marsh," I said. "Good to finally meet you." He shook it. Firm enough, but his eyes had already moved past me, scanning the pipes, the storage racks, the water heater in the corner. "You work here?" he said. "I do," I said. He nodded slowly, the way people nod when they are filing something away. "Maintenance," he said. It was not a question. I told him yes. I told him I had been with the building for a long time. He said something polite and moved on, the way people do when they have already decided what a conversation is worth. Claire hugged me before they left. She held on a moment longer than usual, and I understood that she already knew something was coming that she did not quite know how to stop. I went back to the sink. I picked up the wrench. I finished the job. That is what you do. I should tell you something about myself, and I will tell you now so that you understand why I made the choices I made over the years, because they were choices, not accidents, not circumstances I stumbled into. I grew up in Sudbury, Ontario. My father was a machinist. My mother worked the counter at a bakery on Lorne Street for 23 years. We were not poor in the way that breaks people, but we were never far enough from it to stop being careful. I watched my parents work. I watched them come home tired in a way that had nothing to do with weakness. It was the tiredness of people who had given something real to the day and had nothing left to perform. When I was 31, I started a small property management company with $11,000 I had saved over 8 years, and a second mortgage on a house I could barely afford. I will not tell you it was easy. I will not dress it up. There were years in my mid-30s where I was not sure we would survive the next quarter. There were nights I lay awake running numbers in my head until the ceiling started to blur. But we survived. And then we grew. And then, over time, we became something I had not entirely planned for. By the time I was 50, Marsh Property Group held commercial and residential assets across 6 provinces. We employed over 300 people full-time. Our portfolio was valued at something that would have made the 31-year-old version of me sit down and breathe very slowly. And I kept showing up to work in the buildings. Not every day, not every building, but regularly, quietly, without announcement. I would put on the work clothes and spend a morning doing maintenance alongside the people who kept the properties running. I had done it when the company was small and I could not afford to hire enough people. I kept doing it when the company grew because I found that the buildings told me things in that state that they never told me from behind a desk. I could feel when something was not right. I could have a conversation with a tenant that was honest in a way that conversations in boardrooms rarely are. My staff knew. My operations managers knew. My lawyers knew. My daughter knew, though she had never been entirely comfortable with it, which I understood. Garrett did not know, and for reasons I will explain, I did not rush to tell him. They had been together for about 14 months when Claire brought him to meet me at the building. She had told me about him before that, of course. She was 30 years old, working as a marketing director at a firm in Toronto, and she had met Garrett at a conference in Vancouver. He was a partner at a commercial real estate advisory firm that his father had founded. Third-generation money, the kind that has been around long enough to feel like character rather than circumstance. He was 34. His full name was Garrett Fenwick. His family had a house in Rosedale and a cottage on Lake Joseph, which Claire mentioned with a kind of nervous brightness that made me pay attention. I am not a man who judges people by their backgrounds. I am a man who grew up watching my mother count change at the end of the week, and I understand that where you come from does not determine what you are made of. Some of the finest people I have known came from families with very little. Some of the most difficult people I have encountered came from families with a great deal. What I judge people on is simpler than that. I watch how they treat the people around them who they believe have nothing to offer them. That tells me most of what I need to know. The morning in the basement told me something. I filed it away. Over the following months, there were other things to file. There was the evening Claire brought him to my apartment. I keep a modest 2-bedroom in the annex, nothing that announces itself, and he spent 20 minutes talking about a property investment he was advising on near the waterfront. And at no point in that conversation did he ask me a single question. Not about where I had worked, not about what I knew about property, not about anything at all. He was a man who had learned to perform interest without experiencing it. There was a Sunday dinner in February, the 4 of us at a restaurant on Cumberland, where he talked about the city's development corridor with the fluency of someone who had studied it. And when the conversation turned toward labor and the tradespeople who actually built the corridor, he said something that I have thought about many times since. He said, "Those guys do fine. The unions make sure of that." It was not cruel. It was something worse than cruel. It was indifferent, in a way that had clearly never been examined. Claire changed the subject. I noticed that she changed it quickly. There was a Saturday in March, when he came to the building with her again, this time because she was helping me move some files from a storage unit on the 3rd floor. He sat in the lobby and looked at his phone, not because he was busy, because it did not occur to him that there was anything else he should be doing. I did not say anything to Claire about any of this. She was happy. The happiness was real, I could see that. And I am her father, not her manager. My job was not to tell her who to love. My job was to be there when she needed me. But I kept filing things away. The engagement was announced in April. Claire called me on a Thursday evening, and I could hear in her voice that particular quality of joy that is large enough to be a little frightening. I told her I was happy for her. I meant it. I told her I looked forward to getting to know Garrett better. I meant that too, in the way you mean something when you are still hoping it might become true. The engagement party was planned for the end of June. It was to be held at the Fenwick family's home in Rosedale, which I had never seen but which Claire described as large. She said the guest list was about 70 people. She mentioned, in a tone I recognized as bracing, that most of the guests would be from Garrett's side, because the party had been organized by his mother. His mother's name was Diane Fenwick. I had met her once, briefly, at the restaurant on Cumberland. She had shaken my hand with a kind of practiced warmth that I recognized immediately as the warmth of a person who categorizes people before they finish saying hello. When she shook my hand that evening, I saw her take in my clothes clean, but plain, and my hands, which have never quite lost the texture of someone who has worked with them, and something in her eyes settled into a position that did not move for the rest of the evening. I want to be fair to her. She was not unkind. She was perfectly pleasant. But pleasant is a performance, and I have been around long enough to see what lives underneath it. In early June, Claire called to tell me about the seating arrangements for the party. She was using her careful voice, the one she uses when she is delivering something she has already turned over in her mind many times. She said that the dinner portion of the evening would have assigned seating, and that the Fenwicks had organized the tables by, as she put it, natural groupings. His family and their close friends and business associates would be at the primary tables near the head of the room. Other guests, and here her voice did the thing it does, would be at tables further back. I was at a table near the kitchen. I said that was fine. She said, "Dad, it's not, I didn't." I said, "Claire, it's fine. I'll be there." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I love you." And I said I loved her too, and that was the end of it. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment. I did not feel wounded in the way a man feels wounded when someone has broken something inside him. I felt something quieter and, in some ways, harder to describe. I felt the particular sadness of watching someone you love make accommodations they will eventually regret. I said nothing. I put on a decent suit. I showed up. The Fenwick house on Balmoral Avenue was exactly what I expected. Large, Georgian, the kind of house that has been repainted and updated enough times to look permanent without looking new. The garden was immaculate. There were lanterns along the path to the front door. A catering company was running the evening, and the young man at the entrance was holding a clipboard. Inside, it was elegant, in the way that comes easily to people who have always had access to elegance. The flowers were white and cream, there were candles everywhere, and the room smelled like something expensive and floral that I could not have named. Claire found me near the entrance and hugged me. She looked beautiful. She was nervous, but she was beautiful. I told her so. Garrett found me about 15 minutes later. He shook my hand and said he was glad I could make it, the way you say you're glad someone could make it when you did not think very hard about whether they would. His father, Douglas Fenwick, shook my hand and said, "Gordon, is it? Good, good." He had the easy confidence of a man who has never had a reason to be anything other than comfortable, and I did not hold it against him, because very few of us are responsible for the conditions of our own comfort. Diane Fenwick greeted me near the fireplace. She was warm. She was also, I noticed, watching a point somewhere past my left shoulder while we spoke. I found my table, table 7, near the back, near the kitchen door. I was seated with 2 of Claire's colleagues from her marketing firm, a retired teacher who was a distant cousin on my late wife's side, and a couple I had never met who turned out to be Garrett's former neighbors from a condo he had lived in before moving to the house he now owned. The retired teacher's name was Margaret. She was sharp and funny and had strong opinions about the current state of public transit, and we had a fine conversation. I have learned over the years that a good conversation at a bad table is still a good conversation. The speeches began after dinner. Douglas Fenwick spoke first, warmly and at length. Diane spoke next, and she was gracious and practiced, and she said things about her son that were true and proud and, I thought, not entirely without self-congratulation. 3 of Garrett's friends spoke, and they were funny in the way that men are funny when they have been given a microphone among people who already like them. Then Garrett stood up. He thanked his parents. He thanked his friends. He spoke about Claire with a fluency that surprised me a little. There was something genuine there. I will give him that. Some real feeling that came through the performance. He spoke about the future, and then he said this. He said he wanted to acknowledge the family members who had made the trip to be here tonight. He mentioned his aunt from Calgary. He mentioned his grandmother, who was 91 and had come from Hamilton. He mentioned Claire's mother, my former wife Sandra, who was there with her husband Derek. He did not mention me. He paused. He looked at Claire with the look of a man who was wrapping something up, and then he said, "And to the rest of Claire's family, we're grateful you're with us in spirit." That was it. Claire's face did not change. She kept smiling. She has her mother's ability to hold her expression in place when she needs to, and she needed it then, because I saw her jaw tighten in the way it has tightened since she was 7 years old, and trying not to cry in front of people. I kept my face easy. I reached for my water glass. Margaret, beside me, said nothing, but I felt her shift slightly in her chair. After the speeches, during the part of the evening where people moved around and the bar opened, Garrett came and found me. I do not know if Claire had said something to him or if he had thought better of what he had done, but he came to my table and crouched down beside my chair in a way that I think was meant to be disarming. He said, "Gordon, good to have you here, truly." I said, "Thank you for having me." He said, "You know, with all these folks, it gets complicated, seating, the list." He made a gesture that covered, apparently, all the complexity of table 7 near the kitchen. I said, "Of course." He looked at me for a moment, and I looked back at him with an expression that gave him nothing to work with, and he said, "Claire's lucky to have a father who just rolls with it, you know? A lot of guys would be." He paused. "You're easy. That's a good quality." I said, "I found it useful." He laughed. He stood up. He put his hand briefly on my shoulder in the way men do when they want to signal something is settled, and he went back to the room. I drove home that night, and I sat in my car in the parking garage under my building for a while before I went upstairs. I did not cry. I am past the age where things like that make me cry. What I felt was something that did not have a clean name. It was not anger, though anger was part of it. It was not grief, though there was something in it that felt like a small loss. It was the feeling of a man who has worked his entire life to build something real, who has treated every person he encountered as someone worth treating well, who has made every effort to raise a daughter who understood what dignity looked like, and who sat at a table near the kitchen and heard himself described as a spirit. I went upstairs. I made tea. I went to bed. The wedding was planned for the following September, 14 months away. In those 14 months, I watched things unfold with the patience I have built over 6 decades of being alive. There were family dinners in Rosedale that I attended, and at which I was present without being included. There were conversations about the wedding planning that happened around me. There was a Sunday brunch in November where Diane Fenwick asked me, pleasantly and with complete sincerity, whether I was planning to retire soon, and I said I kept busy, and she said, "That's wonderful, the buildings need good people," and she moved on to the next thing. I had a conversation with my daughter in December that I want to describe carefully, because it matters. We were walking in High Park on a Saturday afternoon, and she brought it up herself. She said, "Dad, I know things have been. I know Garrett's family is a lot. I know it's been." She stopped. She started again. She said, "I see it. I want you to know that I see it." I said, "What do you see?" She was quiet for a while. "That they don't, that he sometimes doesn't." Another pause. "You're the best man I know," she said. "I need you to know that." I said, "I know you love him." She said, "I do." I said, "I know you love me." She said, "More than anything." I said, "Then I don't need anything to be different right now. I just need you to keep your eyes open." She looked at me then, with a look I recognized. It was the look she had at 14, standing in the kitchen of the house on Beach Avenue, when she understood something for the first time that she had been trying not to understand. I knew the look. I let it land. We walked the rest of the way in silence that was not uncomfortable. In February of the following year, Marsh Property Group completed the acquisition of a development portfolio in the Greater Toronto Area that had taken 22 months of negotiation to finalize. It was the largest single acquisition in our company's history. My legal team, my CFO, and my operations director were all in the boardroom when we signed. There was champagne, which I drank one glass of and then set aside, because I had never been a man who celebrated for long before moving on to the next thing. There were press inquiries. There was a piece in the Globe. My COO handled most of the public communication because I have always preferred to work without an audience. I was not thinking about Garrett Fenwick during any of this. I want to be clear about that. I was not orchestrating anything. I was not waiting for a moment. I was running my company, the way I had always run it, and I was trusting that the world tends to correct itself if you are patient enough and honest enough to let it. What happened next was not something I planned. In March, Garrett's firm Fenwick Advisory, the company he had taken over from his father 3 years earlier, began preliminary negotiations to secure a significant parcel of land in Etobicoke for a mixed-use development. It was a substantial project, the kind that required equity partners with a specific combination of capital and long-term appetite. One of my development managers brought the opportunity to my attention as part of our regular deal review. It had come through a broker network without names attached. I looked at the project profile. It was good land. The numbers made sense. I said to proceed to the next stage of due diligence. 3 weeks later, my manager came back to my office and said the sellers had confirmed the development partner on the other side of the deal. She put a folder on my desk. Fenwick Advisory. Principals: Douglas Fenwick, retired, advisory capacity, and Garrett Fenwick, managing partner. I sat with that for a moment. I called my lawyer. I called my CFO. I told them to proceed normally. I said I would attend the introductory meeting myself, which I rarely do at this stage of a negotiation, but which raised no particular flags, because my team knows I make my own decisions about when to be present. The meeting was set for a Thursday morning in April, at our offices on Bay Street. I should describe those offices, because this matters. We are on the 24th floor. The reception area is clean and modern, and does not shout, because I have never liked spaces that shout. The boardroom faces south and has a view that, on a clear day, shows you the lake in a way that reminds you what this city is built next to. I arrived before anyone else, the way I always do. I was dressed in what my assistant calls my standard uniform, a gray suit, a white shirt, no tie, because I have earned the right to skip the tie. I sat at the head of the table with a coffee and reviewed the briefing materials my team had prepared. My team arrived. The brokers arrived. And then, at 9:12, Garrett Fenwick walked into the room. He was in a good suit. He was carrying a leather portfolio. He was already talking to one of the brokers in the easy, confident way of a man who has been in many rooms like this one and has always belonged in them. He shook hands around the table. He came to me. He looked at me. I watched his face do something I have seen faces do before, but rarely with that particular sequence. First, recognition. The simple animal fact of placing someone you know. Then confusion, because the context was wrong, because the person you know was not supposed to be here in this room with this view in this suit at the head of this table. Then, something underneath the confusion, something he was working to cover, a recalibration happening in real time, like a compass finding north in a place it did not expect to find it. "Gordon," he said. "Garrett," I said. "Good to see you. Have a seat." He sat down. My COO, Helena, who has been with me for 16 years, began the introduction. She described Marsh Property Group in the terms she always uses: our history, our portfolio, our approach to development partnerships. She mentioned the February acquisition. She mentioned our AUM. She was precise and professional and gave no indication that anything unusual was happening, because for Helena, nothing unusual was happening. This was a Thursday morning meeting. I watched Garrett listen to Helena. I watched him process the numbers. I watched the thing behind his eyes do its work. There is a particular expression that crosses a person's face when they understand, fully, that they have profoundly misjudged a situation. It is not one expression. It is a sequence of them, passing through quickly, each one trying to decide whether to commit. I have seen it in negotiations many times. I have always found it to be more instructive than anything a person says. When Helena finished, I spoke. I talked about the Etobicoke parcel, what I found interesting about it, what our questions were, what our timeline looked like. I was direct and specific, the way I am always direct and specific, because there is no point being in a meeting if you are going to circle the actual subject. Garrett asked good questions. I will say that for him. Whatever was happening inside him, he was a professional, and he managed the meeting with skill. His knowledge of the project was solid. He had done his preparation. At one point, about 40 minutes in, there was a natural pause. I looked at him across the table and said, "Garrett, I think we should acknowledge the situation, since we're both aware of it." He said, "Of course." I said, "I want to be clear that my interest in this project is entirely commercial. The land is good. The structure could work. I would like to proceed on those terms, and I would ask that we both leave the personal history out of the room." He said, "Absolutely." I said, "Good." We continued. At the end of the meeting, we agreed to move to a formal term sheet stage. It was a reasonable outcome. The brokers seemed pleased. After everyone else had left, Garrett stayed. I had expected this. He said, "Gordon?" I said, "Go ahead." He said, "I want to." He stopped. He was a man who had been confident in every room he had ever entered. And he was in a room now where the confidence was not coming easily, and it showed. "I want to say that I didn't know." I said, "I understand." He said, She never explained." I said, "No, she didn't." He looked at me. "Why not?" I said, "I think that's a question worth sitting with." He said, "The engagement party, the way things were set up." I said, "Garrett, I am going to tell you something I believe to be true, and I am going to ask you to hear it as something offered in good faith, not as a confrontation." He nodded. I said, "The question was never what I owned or what I had built. I have never needed anyone to know that in order to know it myself. The question was how you treated a man you believed had nothing. The answer to that question told me something. I have been watching the answer to that question for more than a year." He was quiet. I said, "I genuinely hope you do some thinking about it. Not for my sake. For Claire's." He picked up his portfolio. He said, "I will." I don't know whether he meant it. I still don't know. What I know is that I meant what I said, and that I said it without anger, which is the only way I know how to say things that matter. Claire called me that evening. She had heard from Garrett. I do not know exactly what he said to her, but something had been said, because when she called, her voice had the texture of someone who has just put something down that they have been carrying for a long time. She said, "Why didn't you tell me it was his firm?" I said, "I found out 3 weeks ago. I didn't think it was mine to manage." She said, "Dad." I said, "Claire." She was quiet. Then she said, "He called me tonight. He wasn't unkind. But he was." She paused. He was more concerned about how it looked than about she. Stopped again. He said he felt ambushed. I said, "I understand why he might feel that." She said, "Do you?" I said, "A person who has never examined the way they treat people they consider beneath them is going to feel ambushed when the examination arrives from outside. It's uncomfortable, That's not a reason to call it unfair. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, I've been making excuses. I said, I know. She said, for a long time. I said, I know that too. She said, I thought if I didn't make it a thing. I said, you thought you could love him enough that it wouldn't matter. She said, yes. I said, that is a very human thing to think. She cried a little then. Not completely, she still has her mother's composure, but a little. I let her. After a while I said, whatever you decide, I will be here. I will not tell you what to decide. I have never done that. She said, I know. I said, you have always had good judgment. You have sometimes chosen not to use it. That's different. She laughed, a small, tired laugh. You're very annoying, she said, which is what she has said to me when I have told her something she knows is true, since she was approximately 11 years old. I told her I loved her. She told me she loved me. We said good night. The deal with Fenwick Advisory did not close. This was not my decision, it was a commercial decision, made by my team and their team together, because the equity structure ultimately did not align. These things happen. I did not consider it a loss in any way that mattered. The wedding did not happen either. Claire called off the engagement in June. She told me herself, on a Sunday morning over coffee at a place on Roncesvalles that we had been going to together since she was in university. She was calm. She was sad in the particular way of someone who has grieved something before the ending, which is almost always the easier kind of grief. She said, I kept waiting for him to surprise me. I said, did he? She said, not in the way I wanted. I did not say anything that filled that space. Some spaces should not be filled. She said, I thought about what you said, about keeping my eyes open. I said, I remember. She said, I had them open. I just kept choosing to look at a different thing. I said, that's honest. She said, I learned it from somewhere. We drank our coffee. Outside on Roncesvalles, the Saturday morning was doing what Saturday mornings in Toronto do in June, slow and golden. People with dogs and strollers and nowhere urgent to be. I thought about all the years of mornings with my daughter in them, all the versions of her I had watched become this one. She reached across the table and put her hand on mine. She said, you never made me feel like I'd done something wrong, even at the party. You just showed up. I said, that's the job. She said, it's more than that. I said, maybe. But it starts with showing up. I am 64 years old now. I still go into the buildings. Not as often as I used to, because my operations team has grown, and they run things well, and they do not need me standing over their work, but regularly, because I have found that there is something important that stays alive in a man when he keeps his hands connected to the thing he built. It is too easy, after a certain point, to forget that the work is the thing. The buildings don't care about my portfolio valuation. They care about the pipes and the wiring and whether the recycling gets sorted correctly on Tuesdays. I am not telling this story to make myself into something I am not. I was not patient because I was virtuous. I was patient because I am 64 years old and I have learned, slowly and sometimes painfully, that the world tends to show you who people are if you give it enough time and stay out of the way. I was not waiting to expose Garrett Fenwick. I did not engineer what happened. It happened because I run a company that looks at good land, and his company brought good land to the table, and the world is smaller than people think it is, and has less patience for dishonesty than people hope. What I want to leave you with is simpler than any of that. The way you treat someone who can do nothing for you is the truest information you will ever give about yourself. It does not matter what you say at dinner parties, or how impressive your work is, or how confident you look walking into a room. The moment when you have decided consciously or not that the person in front of you is beneath you, and you treat them accordingly, that moment is the most honest thing about you. It stays in the room longer than you do. My father used to say that a person's character is what they do when they think nobody important is watching. He said it to me when I was young enough that I did not fully understand it. I understand it now. I have tried to live it, imperfectly, because all of us live things imperfectly. But I have tried. I hope my daughter carries that forward. I believe she will. She is already better at it than I am. And I want to say one more thing, because I think it matters. I am not angry at Garrett Fenwick. I am not angry at Diane. I am not angry at the seating chart, or the speech, or the hand on my shoulder after the engagement party. What I feel, if I am honest, is something closer to sadness for people who have had so much for so long that they have never been required to find out what they are actually made of. That is a harder way to live than it looks from the outside. The test comes eventually. It always does. The only question is whether you have done anything to prepare for it. Claire is building her life on her own terms now. She bought a place in Leslieville, a 100-year-old semi that needs work. She has been asking me questions about contractors and structural assessments and what to look for in old wiring, and I answer them the way I answer everything specifically and directly, and without making it harder than it has to be. Last Saturday, she came to the building to have breakfast with me. I was in the lobby when she arrived, talking with Frank, one of our maintenance staff who has been with us for 11 years and who has a son playing AAA hockey in Barrie and who I have been following along with for most of that kid's career. Claire watched us talk. Afterward, walking up to my office, she said, "You know everyone here." I said, "I've been here a long time." She said, "No, I mean you actually know them." I said, "They do the work. Of course I know them." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I think I'm starting to understand something I should have understood a long time ago." I said, "What's that?" She said, "It's not about the buildings." I smiled. "No," I said, "it never was.